So the first draft of this episode starts off with a scene of Allison and Emily. So in this version, we actually were going to see Emily for one scene, and the episode kicks off with them saying their goodbyes at Doherty's Landing. And if you don't remember, that was the landing strip that we learned about in the very end of the second season of PLL that Allison was flying in and out of when she was doing all of her crazy travels around the night of her disappearance. So a private plane has come to take Allison off to Beacon Heights University, and they are saying their goodbyes. So this lines up really well with those early interviews that Marlene and Sasha Petersa and Sarah Shepard gave, claiming that Emerson was alive and well in the spinoff. This is where that comes from. This was the draft that they were talking about. So they also give a little bit of background about why Allison is going to BHU, why Emily is not going with her. They explained that Allie was given a scholarship to go to grad school and be a TA. She was given full tuition. She was given a house to live in and a car to drive. And it's just one of those opportunities that she just can't pass up. And the reason Emily can't go too is because the school wasn't able to lose her as a teacher. So they could part with Allison for a year, but they couldn't part with Emily as well. So I'll get into my thoughts on this later, but that's just sort of an overview of what they talk about. It's very exposition-y. It's also very romantic in that super cliche way. It totally would have made the shippers go absolutely crazy. And it's basically what I saw a lot of them arguing should have happened instead of the divorce that we actually got in the show. So I'm sure if there are any Emerson shippers watching this, that's going to make you all really mad because that's what we came close to getting. Following that, there's a really brief scene between the pilots who are flying Allison to Beacon Heights, remarking on the similarities between Allison and somebody named Taylor, which we'll get into more later.
Who the are you?
So then we cut to Allison at Beacon Heights. She's arrived, and we meet our next character, who is actually a brand new character that we didn't see in the actual show, Professor Granger, who is the lit professor that Allison is TAing for. And he shows her around campus. He explains the Hotchkiss family's connection to the school, that they're super wealthy. They've given a lot of money to the school, and they oversee basically the scholarship recipients, and that's pretty much it. So what I really noticed about this scene, and the only real note I have about it, is that it's essentially the first version of the scene of Mona showing Allie around the school that we get in the episode. It's a lot longer, and essentially the dialogue is very similar, and it's obvious that that scene was sort of the inspiration for the scene with Mona and Allie that we end up getting. After that, we cut to the first day of class. Allison is teaching. She's introducing herself. Now, this scene is not line by line the same as the one in the show, but it's very similar. Most of the lines are the same. This is the scene in this version where we're first introduced to Ava and Dylan and Caitlin and Nolan, really. He comes up a little bit earlier in the script. He's like spying on a bunch of computer monitors, but this is the first time we really meet him. So we don't get that introductory scene that we did in the actual show where we're meeting them all for the first time. This is our first introduction to them. The real key difference here that I took notice of is that Ava is portrayed as much smarter and more driven. Just like in the actual episode, she's called out on not doing the summer reading assignment, but in this version, she explains that she was coding a new program over the summer, and that was why she wasn't able to do it, as opposed to the explanation we get in the final draft that she was working on building her YouTube channel. So she's portrayed as a little bit more driven and ambitious, rather than just kind of a slacker, as she is in the real show. So after the first scene in the classroom, we get that scene outside of the building, which this one is pretty much word for word the same as in the show, with Caitlin and Ava and Dylan and Nolan all talking about the papers that Dylan is going to keep writing for Ava and Nolan. We have that little scene with Caitlin and Dylan afterwards talking about how they were hoping things would be different this school year, and not really much to say about this because, like I said, it's pretty much word for word what we ended up getting on the show. So then things take another very different turn. We go back to the house where Allison is staying in, and we're introduced to a second brand new character named Josh, and he is another TA. He's I believe a psychology TA, which is mentioned later. So they end up going out for frozen yogurt. He introduces himself. He's showing her around the town. Allison's giving him a little background on herself, how she used to be this mean girl and she's changed and reformed herself. And in this version, this is where we learn that Taylor committed suicide, whereas in the actual episode, we find that out much earlier. Mona's the one who tells Allie that. This is where we learn it now, so it comes much later in the episode. After that scene, we learn a little bit more about Nolan's family. We meet his parents, and I said parents because in this version, Nolan's father is alive. You might remember that in the actual show, we learn that his dad was murdered by muggers, I believe, or something like that before the show started. But that storyline is not at all a thing in this version. He's alive. His name is Nolan Sr. And then we have Nolan's mom, whose name has been changed from Claire to Catherine in this draft. The one interesting thing to note is that they mention somebody named Dr. Fielder, and they bring up a theory that it seems like they used to believe that Nolan could have killed Taylor instead of her committing suicide. So speaking of Dr. Fielder, we then cut to what's referred to in the notes as Beacon Heights Hospital, and Dr. Fielder visiting a mystery patient. And we don't learn who the mystery patient is. That comes later in the episode, but if you think back to who else was supposed to be starring in this episode, who we haven't seen yet, should be pretty obvious. Then we get a little more into the new Perfectionist characters. We have a scene with Caitlin where we meet Jeremy, and we get the wonderful line in the narrative about his mandatory PLL spin-off 12-pack. We also learn, less importantly, that he's a rocket scientist, even though it also states that he's only 21, so he should really still be in college, but whatever. Starts off with Jeremy and Caitlin talking about their secret relationship. Jeremy wants Caitlin to back out of her deal with Nolan because they're, just like in the final episode, in this fake relationship where they're pretending to date to satisfy their parents. So we get a flashback where we learn sometime in the past, Jeremy had been mugged on a trip to Seattle. Caitlin's helping clean him up. Then outside, she gets confronted by Nolan, and instead of blackmailing her with her mom's adultery, he tells her that he was the one who caused Jeremy's mugging, and basically tells her that if she doesn't keep up the lie and keep being in this fake relationship with him, he will make sure that something bad actually does happen to Jeremy. After that, we cut to a quick scene with Dylan and Andrew. We learn that they're still a couple. They're pretty much just as they are in the final episode. After that, we get a really quick poolside scene of Nolan and Ava. It's very similar to the one in the show, so I'm not going to talk much about it other than to say that it goes into a little more detail about Ava's programming, about her ambitions and kind of what she's working on, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. So then we get an interesting scene where we kind of start getting into the main conflict of this episode, which, just like in the actual pilot, is Allison beginning to discover the plagiarism that's going on with these papers. So she figures out that Dylan has written both Nolan and Ava's papers, and she goes to Granger with these suspicions. And Granger warns her not to pursue it. He doesn't take it seriously, and he explains to her that Nolan has everybody fooled, he has more power than either of them have, and she's not going to win against him. So she's pretty defeated by that, and she's not willing to let it drop. And right after that, she gets a call from Nolan's mother, Catherine, inviting her over for a cocktail. So then Allison decides to take matters into her own hands. She confronts Ava about the plagiarism, and we get a flashback from Ava's perspective that explains that at some point in the past, I guess the school year before, she had gone to Granger complaining about a bad grade he'd given her in a former class, and we find out that he attempted to sexually assault her when she tried to get him to raise her grade, in kind of a tit-for-tat thing. So, obvious question here is, why is Marlene Kane so freaking obsessed with both student-teacher relationships and predators? That's really the only question I have. Somebody please tell me. So thankfully, Nolan swoops in, saves Ava from being assaulted, and back in the present day, she wants no part of Allison's cheating accusation. She basically tells Allie, you have no idea how things work around here. And then they go into a quick discussion about Ava's parents and how they're on the run. It's pretty much the same as in the actual pilot. We get a quick scene of Allison having drinks at the Hotchkiss house. It's weird. They're creepy. They bring up how similar she is to Taylor, which is exactly what Nolan said they would say. Not much else to say about that. Allison meets up with Caitlin, and we get another scene that's very similar to the one in the episode. It's pretty much the scene between them at the party in the pilot, except this one takes place at like a diner. That is directly followed by the scene of Ava walking in on Nolan, cheating on her. The only difference is that instead of him cheating with one of her fashion models, he's cheating with her roommate, and he breaks up with her in the exact same way he did in the pilot. Then we jump to Allison confronting Dylan, just like she confronted Ava. We get a flashback from his perspective to Nolan seducing him. It's much more extensive than the version we got in the actual show. In present day, Dylan denies the plagiarism, flat out says he didn't do anything wrong. And just like we saw on screen, Allison gives him the chance to come clean himself before she reports him officially. Again, just like we saw on the show, we see Ava following Nolan to an abandoned house. She sees him with a woman, believes he's cheating on her. In reality, of course, it's Taylor, just like we saw in the actual show. He tells Taylor that he had to break up with Ava. They discuss this mysterious Dr. Fielder and a secret patient who is hopefully going to tell them more about Allison and how she can help them, so that's interesting. I'll get into that later. What's also interesting is that in the show itself, it was Nolan who brought up Allison, brought up how he thought she could help them. And Taylor was really resistant to that, whereas in this version, it's Taylor who's really pushing for Nolan to get someone who can help them. So it's kind of the opposite. We jump from there straight to the rooftop scene, which we saw in the show with Nolan and who turns out to be his unknown killer. And then right after that, we don't even see him get pushed off the roof. We just find out he's dead. It happens very quickly, much quicker than it happens on the show. So that's pretty much where the episode ends in the final version, but that's not where the episode ends in this draft. We then cut to Nolan's funeral. We see Allison with Josh. We find out through Josh's perspective and memories that he was with Taylor physically before Taylor committed suicide, supposedly. He lies to Allison about it, tells her they were just colleagues, didn't really know each other. After the funeral, we jump to the diner, which seemed to be a pretty prominent location for this show. Caitlin and Dylan are hanging out together. They both all of a sudden, with no preamble, confess their secrets to each other. Caitlin tells Dylan that she was in a secret relationship with Jeremy, and Dylan tells Caitlin that he hooked up with Nolan before the show began. And it just kind of comes out of nowhere, and it was really weird. They also establish, once Ava joins them, that nobody has an alibi for the night of Nolan's death. And then they all get a text that says, "I still see everything. N." So then we get our final last little scene. We're back in BHU's hospital, and the episode ends with the revelation that Dr. Fielder's secret patient is none other than Mona, of course. There's a reference to Mary and Alex, that they're not too far away, and the episode ends with Fielder pushing for information about Allison in a scene that's very reminiscent to me of that flashback of Cece visiting Mona in Radley from her reveal episode.
I need to know everything.
And that is how the draft of the pilot episode comes to an end, with Mona in this mental hospital being grilled about Allison. Okay, so now that the actual recap is out of the way, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about my thoughts on the overall episode. So I'm going to start out with talking about the things that I liked and things I preferred in this version to the final version that we saw on screen. So first of all, I'll start with Mona's role, which is probably the most obvious difference between the two drafts. I thought her role was much more intriguing in this version. Being in the mental hospital, we don't know how she ended up getting to Beacon Heights, why they brought her there, the connection between her and Allison. So I'm interested to know where they would have gone with that if they'd continued that storyline in the show, because it's obviously way different than anything we actually saw on screen with her role. As far as Allison's role goes, even though it was very similar to what we saw in the actual pilot, I thought her role as the TA was much more realistically written in this episode. That was one of my biggest complaints with her role in the show itself, is that it felt like even though they made her the teaching assistant, she felt in a way like the actual professor. It felt almost like they wanted her to be the professor and like the regular teacher of the class, but they knew that they wouldn't be able to get away with that because there's no way she'd have the qualifications. So they just made her the TA, but then we never saw or heard about the professor, and she just basically stepped into that role. And that always felt really unrealistic to me. So I really like how in this version, they made it clear that she's the TA. We actually see the professor. He's a presence in the show. He's an actual character. I really like that when Allison began to uncover the plagiarism scandal, instead of just immediately taking matters into her own hands, her first reaction was to go to Dr. Granger and present it to him. And then it was only after he basically told her that he wanted nothing to do with it that she took it on herself. I thought just her role was written in a much more natural way, and I wish that that had been explored more in the show, that the professor character had been more of a presence. I also really like the focus on Nolan's family structure in this version, and in particular, I really like that his father is alive, and they didn't do that whole weird murder storyline with him, where he was like murdered in an alley and Taylor was there. I can't judge it too much because, of course, we only got 10 episodes into the show, so we didn't get to see if or how that was going to end up connecting to the overall plot and to her character and to Nolan's murder. So maybe it all would have totally made sense in the end. But as it was, I always felt like that was really kind of superfluous and unnecessary and just took focus away from storylines that I felt like were more important and central to the whole plot. So I like that that wasn't a factor in this version. It felt a little bit less jumbled. And then the last main thing I want to talk about as far as things I preferred about this first draft is Ava as an overall character. I really like that they made her, as I mentioned in my recap, a little more driven and ambitious. They didn't try and make her sort of this slacker who's just wants to be famous on YouTube and that's about it. They switched her focus more to a programmer and a website designer, which fell in line with her interest in fashion, as opposed to what they did in the actual show, which was just make her a fashion designer. Especially considering we already just had that whole storyline with Hannah at the end of PLL with her becoming a fashion designer. It felt really repetitive and cliche that once again we've got this character who's this major fashionista. I thought this was a little more unique and interesting, and I also felt it connected the fashion part of her personality, which I believe was an aspect in the books as well with Ava's character. So it made sense that they wanted to incorporate that again. But it connected that with the tech side of her. That was one of my biggest complaints about Ava's character in the show, was it felt like they just threw in this whole thing about, oh, she also happens to be this incredible cyber hacker for no reason. Like there was no reason for it, and it just felt really trite and contrived. Whereas in this draft, it makes sense because sort of the whole reason she's at the school is because she's this programmer and web designer, and she just so happens to also be interested in fashion, so that's what all of her programming and design stuff focuses on. Whereas in the actual show, it felt a lot more disjointed, and like there wasn't really a reason behind her being so good at tech stuff, except they just needed a character who was for when the plot called for it. So that's, out of the main characters, I think I really preferred Ava the most in this draft. Now, as far as things that I did not like about this draft, or things that I preferred about the final draft, starting off again with Mona, although I just said that I was really intrigued by her role in this draft, ultimately, I prefer her role in the actual pilot. I think for me, it comes back to the fact that Mona was billed from the minute this show was announced as a main character, and she ended up getting second billing in the actual show. So seeing her with such a limited role, even if it was just in the pilot, for me at least would have been really disappointing. Who's to say that this would have remained her role? Like, I'm sure as the season went on, they would have incorporated her more into the main plot of the show. But even just talking about the pilot, only seeing her for a minute and a half at the very end would have been really disappointing, considering I think most of us were going into this show operating under the assumption that she was going to be one of the main characters. So I like that they did incorporate her into the core group and make her what really felt like a main part of the show in the final version. Of course, I have to talk about Emerson. I can't post this video without mentioning that. And I know this is going to be a super unpopular opinion, but I have to say that as somebody who never liked that pairing, I was super happy with the direction they ended up going in the final version, and definitely preferred that to the overly cliche romantic ending they were given in this draft. I mean, looking back at that scene, it's so obvious that that scene was created in order to pander to the shippers. I mean, their state is exactly what the shippers wanted, like down to the T. But if you ask me, and this is even just removing my personal dislike of Emerson, it really doesn't make any sense. Like, when you really read the explanation behind how they're still together, even though they're living on opposite sides of the country, it's weak. It really doesn't make sense from a logical perspective. You know, I think if I was 13 years old reading this, it would totally make sense to me and it would all add up and I would completely go along with it. But like, as a grown adult reading this, it just doesn't add up. The fact that, okay, Allison was given this great opportunity, but she was still, she found it worth it to still leave her whole family for a year when she easily could have gone to graduate school somewhere near Rosewood, even if it maybe wasn't as prestigious. The fact that for some reason Emily is just kowtowing to the principal and being like, oh, well, I guess I can't leave because he doesn't want me to, when she easily could move alongside Allison, who says they even have to come back to Rosewood. It just felt very contrived. And I think it really kind of shut the door for a lot of character progression on Allison's part, sticking her in this off-screen relationship with really no way out of it, since Emily wasn't going to be a character on the show. So they really were going to back themselves into a corner with that, and I'm glad that instead they ended up just giving Allison a totally clean slate. Just in general, reading the script, this is more a note about the screenwriting as opposed to what we actually would have seen on screen. It's really poorly written. Like, it's poorly written to the point that I actually, after reading it for the first time, had to go back and do a little research because I was convinced that it was fan-made. Like, it's just really, really badly written. It's juvenile in its writing. There's all these mentions of OMG and hashtag this or that in the narrative. For some reason, everybody in this show is referred to as hot or attractive a million times. There's even instances where there's a character who's like a little cameo side character who's unnamed, who's literally listed as attractive woman. Like, that's her name in the script. So I always thought that was a weird detail. Like, we get it. Everybody's attractive in Hollywood and in this perfect world of Beacon Heights, but just the fact that it was focused on so much was really bizarre to me and took me out of reading the script. One element that was actually missing from this draft that I'm so glad they went back to and added in was that there's an entire scene in the final draft of Ava, Caitlin, and Dylan meeting up in the woods discussing how they're sick of Nolan and they wish he would just go away, and they start kind of fantasizing about all of these ways he could fall to his gruesome death. And then right after that, he ends up falling to his gruesome death. And that's like the central aspect of the show. And that really is continuous with the book storyline, that this group of kids was wishing for the death of this guy, and then he ends up dying in exactly the way they'd fake planned out. So then that's why they end up becoming suspects and involved to begin with, because they're so paranoid about it. That scene was missing completely from this draft, which I actually went back a few times looking for it, thinking I must have skipped over it, but no, it's not in there. So I think that was a really weird choice, because that's literally the central premise of this show and of the book series this show is based off of. So I'm so glad they ended up going back and putting that back in, because I think otherwise it makes the three perfectionists' involvement in the storyline of Nolan's murder really weak. On the subject of the new characters, I addressed that I really liked Professor Granger's involvement. When it comes to the other brand new character, Josh, I kind of feel the opposite. He feels a little bit irrelevant to me, and it felt really obvious reading this script that he would have ended up either being evil or as some sort of love interest for Allison, which would have been weird for them to do with how they ended things with Emerson in this version. It feels like they just sort of added him in because they wanted Allison to have some sort of confidant. And what they ended up doing in the final version instead was giving that role to Mona. She's the one who becomes Allison's closest friend and the one she can confide in, and they can confide in each other. So I think that was such a better decision than trying to get us attached to some new character. I mean, Allison and Mona's friendship in this show was my absolute favorite part of watching it, and the thing that I missed the most from it. So I think that was a great opportunity that they took to incorporate that relationship in and strengthen that already existing bond, instead of trying to incorporate some brand new character that nobody really cares about. This is a little thing, but I have to address that text at the end and how it's way too similar to A, obviously. Already, one of my biggest issues with the show in its final version was how many callbacks and references and parallels there were to the original PLL, to the point that they were completely replicating storylines in almost sort of this winking to the audience, like, hey, look, we're doing it again kind of way, that it just made the show seem really unoriginal. And this would have just taken that to a whole new level. The show already suffered from seeming kind of cheap and repetitive, and like they couldn't come up with their own stuff, so they were just copying what they'd already done. And like I said, this just would have totally elevated that, so at least they had enough sense to take that out. And the last little thing I want to touch on is that I felt like way too much was revealed in this episode. Not only do we learn all of the perfectionist secrets, as we did in the pilot, I believe, but they learn all about each other's secrets. Like I mentioned in my recap, at the very end, there's that scene where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Caitlin and Dylan start confessing their secrets to each other. You know, nothing felt earned. They weren't even friends yet. So that was something that really kind of kept the show going in the final version, that there are these big confrontations later on as they build their friendship and they start learning more about each other and their secrets start coming out. Whereas that aspect would have been missing from this original storyline because they've already confessed their secrets to each other. So that's another very positive change, I think. And with that, that pretty much brings me to the end of an already super long video. So even though I just went on a big tangent about a whole list of things that I did not like about this draft, I have to say that I really enjoyed reading this. It was so exciting to finally see the first draft of the show, especially after a few years ago hearing all of these interviews and mentions to things in it. I've always been so curious to find out what we were missing in that original draft and how different it really was. So I hope you guys enjoyed listening to and watching this video, and I would love to make more videos like this. I don't know if any other scripts from the original drafts of PLL episodes or Perfectionist episodes have been released. So if you ever find anything like that, please just let me know, and I would love to keep making videos like this. I hope you enjoyed.